Good evening, everyone, and good morning, I think, for our host, Dr. Nada Elia, who is speaking from the United States at this very moment. I feel very, very honored to have the chance to host this first event that, as Sama explained, is part of a lecture series that was organized by a group of PhD students from the Department of Social Sciences at the University of Basel. I think there are many things can be said, and we will leave the floor, of course, to Dr. Elia to illustrating, the historical context, and also in order to understand, how we get here, how we get to the present, how we understand the brutal violence that is perpetrated against the Palestinian people through what are the lessons of history. This is an important thing and an important conversation that we want to share with a wider group that hopefully will grow bigger and bigger. And I think it's an important note also, we were doing this through the initiative of the students also to kind of create a more safe space for discussion and conversation at the University of Basel. For the little that we can do is to kind of foster this debate and as Sema has said, kind of bring to the table and to the forefront the presence of Palestinian voices in order to understand what is happening now. So before kind of, starting this conversation that, as Sama has said, will be followed by, the presentation of Dr. Elia, and then half an hour of conversation. Just a few rules also for those that want to interact after the presentation. You're very welcome to open your camera and show up and speak. But of course, if you prefer not to do in this way, we are very welcome to paste your question in the chat, and we will pick it from there. So, without any further ado, I'm again very, very pleased and honored to welcome Dr. Nada Elia for this first event. Dr. Elia is a diaspora Palestinian scholar activist, and she's the founding member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective, and currently she serves on its coordinating committee. Among other texts and books, she is the author of Greater Than the Sum of Our Parts, Feminism, Internationalism, and Palestine. The title of her talk today is Contextualizing Gaza, and she will kind of offer an historical overview from the 1917 Balfour Declaration to the 1948 Nakba and the 1967 illegal occupation of the rest of historic Palestine, going through the 2018 Basic Law declaring Israel as a Jewish state, to the election of a self-acknowledged fascist homophobe to the Knesset, and the current calls for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza. In this context, Dr. Elia will present on the historical context of the current humanitarian crisis in Gaza and what urgently needs to be done now. Thank you all, and thanks, Dr. Elia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for organizing this. Thank you for, for organizing a series of talks about this topic. I'm honored to be invited. I'm honored to be the first one. I'm particularly grateful to you, Emilio, because you actually pronounced my name right. It's Nada Elia, and you're doing it right. My name gets massacred all the time, and wow, I'm actually hearing my name as it should be pronounced. So thank you for that too. But really, more seriously, thank you for organizing this in a climate of extreme censorship. I was talking earlier to the organizers, and I said, there's a blockade on Gaza that's suffocating. There's also a blockade on Palestinian voices internationally, mostly in the West, that censors us so much that opportunities to speak become more precious and more rare by the day. Only yesterday, I believe, that Florida banned the chapters of SJP on campuses. SJP is the Students for Justice in Palestine, and it's a national organization with many chapters, student chapters across very many universities. I think most universities have an SJP chapter, Students for Justice in Palestine, as I said, and Florida banned the SJP chapters yesterday. My understanding is that Canada is moving to similarly ban. In Canada, it's called SPHR, Students for Palestinian Human Rights, and Canada is also moving to ban the SPHR student chapters on campuses. Of course, we know what the media does. I mean, the media is completely censoring Palestinian narratives and giving a platform to the complete Zionist narrative, which is truth, untruth after untruth after untruth. And it's like, so opportunities to speak become even more precious. And I appreciate that. And I really want to thank you for that. And I love the idea that I'm just giving the background and then that basically others are going to give more details. So yeah, I did want to say that, of course, I'm not going to focus on what is currently going on. I think, I mean, anyone who's here, I hope, is actually aware of what's going on. I will not mince words. It's a genocide, and I will actually be giving the definition of genocide. But I do want to give, as I said, as Emilio said, the historical background beginning in 1917. And for that, I'm going to be actually sharing my screen with a PowerPoint. So let me do that. So basically, I want to start with contextualizing and going back to 1917. In 1917, that is during the First World War, as the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, the imperial powers, the European powers that knew that they were going to take over the ruins of the Ottoman Empire decided that basically one solution to Europe's anti-Semitism would be to give Jews a country of their own, not in Europe, but somewhere else. And of course, Palestine was a logical choice because it is the birthplace of Judaism. And the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, as I said, during the First World War, and the Ottoman Empire was in control of Palestine, and the winning countries, the victorious countries, or the countries that they knew they would be victorious during the First World War, were already dividing up everything that the Ottoman Empire, as it was crumbling, would be abandoning. So, and there was, of course, there had been a long-standing history of anti-Jewish hatred in Europe, which culminated in many pogroms, in laws discriminating against Jews, and as this was happening, and the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, and there was the Jewish problem in Europe, Europe decided, okay, we're going to create a land for the Jewish, a homeland for the Jews. This was at the peak of European imperialism, and ventures in Africa and Asia, and in the European mind, you know, like we take a country, we transform it. This was what was going on. This is what Europe was doing at the time. So one more such venture of like taking over a country and transforming it was perfectly in keeping with what these countries had been doing for 4 centuries or more. Zionism was at its origin an imperial colonial ideology, very much in keeping with all of European empires. So as the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, the Europeans decided, okay, we're going to create a state in Palestine, a Jewish state in Palestine. So the Balfour Declaration of 1917 is a declaration by the British government to the Zionist to the European Zionist organization. And here it is, those 69 words, as you know, many of us think those are 69 words that changed the fate of the Arab world. November 2nd, 1917, a letter from James Balfour to Lord Rothschild. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. So this is the British cabinet approving of the request by the Zionist, the Jewish Zionist company. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights of and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would convey this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour. So if we look at this declaration, obviously the British Empire declaring that a country can be created in another one, you know, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And then it says, you know, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done that may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. I mean, this is such a very cavalier way of saying that the Palestinians, you know, it doesn't even name them, the non-Jewish communities in Palestine, who happen to be 93% of the people. Like, how can you possibly create a country on top of another country without prejudicing, without doing any harm to the civil and religious rights of the indigenous people who were already there? Okay, so that's like, it's impossible to do that. And what we see today is the impossibility of doing that. The second part is being clearly understood that nothing would do the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other countries, meaning that just because we are creating a Jewish homeland for them in Palestine doesn't mean that they lose their rights in other countries. So that part is perfectly understandable, that they don't lose their rights in other countries. But what's not understandable in any way is the possibility of actually not hurting the so-called non-Jewish communities, the Palestinian people, the indigenous people in Palestine, by creating Israel over Palestine. Again, I want to say that it's the European Jews who were behind this effort completely understood that this was colonialism. So basically, the Zionist leaders knew that they would be destroying Palestinian life, land, and violating rights, and that there was an indigenous people that would not agree to that. So let's get there. So Jabotinsky, in The Iron Wall, which he wrote in 1923, he was writing that Jabotinsky is one of the leading early Zionist thinkers and ideologues, and he was like envisioning the Israel that's going to be taking place in Palestine. And he knew that there would be a resistance. He knew that there would be a people for whom this is unacceptable. So in this pamphlet called The Iron Wall, he writes, every reader he was writing to, you know, every reader has some idea of the early history of other countries that have been settled. So he's talking about settlement, settler colonialism. I suggest that he may recall all known instances. The inhabitants, no matter whether they are civilized or savages, have always put up a stubborn fight. It is of no importance whether we quote Herzl or Herbert Samuel to justify our activities. Colonization itself has its own explanation, integral and inescapable, and understood by every Arab and every Jew with his wits about him. Colonization can only have one goal. For the Palestinian Arabs, this goal is inadmissible. Zionist colonization, even the most restricted, must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native population. I'm giving this bit of background because I want to establish that from the get-go, the initial vision of Israel was a settler-colonial country, whether it was the imperial powers, namely Britain, saying, okay, we're going to give part of this land to this people, which is a very, very imperial move that was very typical of the, you know, European imperialism, or the Zionist thinkers themselves, such as Jabotinsky, naming Zionism as a colonial and as a colonial, settler-colonial plan initiative that would be objected to by the Palestinian people. As he says, I cannot conceive, wherever we look around the world, the indigenous people have always put up a resistance, whether they're savages or civilized, they're always going to resist. There's no instance of colonialism that is accepted by the people. The Palestinians are going to put up a stubborn fight. And that's basically what Palestinians have been doing, is basically resisting. But again, we're talking about the previous century and an era of colonialism. Excuse me, I need a sip of water. Anyway, so then between 1917, the Balfour Declaration, and 1948, you know, we have the Second World War, we have the Holocaust happening, we have the need for European Jews to feel secure, and Europe was very, remains to this day in many ways, extremely anti-Semitic. So then the United Nations decided that it would partition Palestine and it would give 55% of Palestine to Israel. In 1948, as Israel was being founded with the blessing of the European powers, in 1948, there was fighting. There was, of course, resistance on the part of the Palestinians, as well as is expected, as Jabotinsky himself knew, as every person who's ever looked at history. Of course, the indigenous fight for their land. Of course, it is our land. Why would we be dispossessed? So there was fighting. Again, it was extremely lopsided because prior to that, under the British mandate, Britain had been very, very, very forceful in its repression of Palestinian resistance. There had been already in the 20s, there had been resistance to the British plans. Certainly the Great Revolt of 1936 to 1939, which was a Palestinian revolt against Britain's plans to create an Israel in Palestine, that was very, very harshly repressed by Britain. A full 10% of the Palestinian adult male population was either exiled or killed. Anyone caught with a rifle, with a weapon of any sort, would be killed, sometimes imprisoned very frequently, exiled. The Palestinians actually rounded up, Britain rounded up Palestinians and exiled them, took them all the way to Chile, all the way to the Seychelles, in order to quash the resistance to Britain's Europe's imperial plans. So we're talking about a resistance that even precedes the creation of Israel, because the Palestinians want their land, don't want to be dispossessed. So in the 20s, there was a resistance that Britain quashed. 1936 to 39, the repression was so harsh. You know, as I said, if you were caught with a weapon of anything, you know, a rusty old rifle, you would either be killed, exiled, or go to jail. And as I said, a full 10% of the Palestinian adult male population was killed, exiled, or sent to jail under Britain during those years. And anyone, so there was basically the Palestinian people was unarmed, and the Jewish Zionist militias at the time were becoming heavily armed because they were smuggling in weapons. And so during the fight that happened in 1948, as Israel was being created, Israel ended up with not the 55% of Palestine that the UN had initially decided it would have, but with 70% of Palestine, that because of the fighting and because of what they want, despite the fact that there actually is international law that says that the inadmissibility of gaining land by fighting. So, you know, Israel says, well, we won the land because we were attacked or something like that, but it's actually unacceptable and inadmissible under international law to claim land gained in fighting, because otherwise everyone's going to be fighting other countries and take the land. The winner takes the land, right? So it's actually against international law. So basically, when Israel was created in 1948, it was created through again, in fighting at a time when it was already very, very unequal, because by then the Zionist militias were armed and the Palestinians were intentionally disarmed by the British over the years of dispossession under the British mandate. So a full 80% of the Palestinian people were dispossessed in 1948 were displaced in 1948 with the creation of Palestine, of Israel. 80% were basically pushed out. Now maybe I will show my map. Let's see. Uh-oh. So I'm going to share my screen. So this is what we call the disappearing Palestine land. In okay, why am I? In 1947, before the creation of Israel, but in the meantime, you know, again, think of European anti-Semitism, think of the Holocaust, think of how many Jews were actually trying to leave Europe and actually being prevented from leaving Europe. From going in, for example, they were not allowed into the US. They were turned away from so many countries. So the one country that they could turn to was Palestine. This was, so when we look here at the white, which is where there is Jewish settlements, that's already an overrepresentation. That's not how it was in 1917. That's not how it was in 1920. That's at the end of, you know, the peak of anti-Semitism in Europe. That's how many Jewish settlements there were. Now, the 1947 partition plan shows us what Palestine would have been and Israel would have been. As I said, Israel was going to get 55%. 1948, when Israel was created, this is Israel and this is Palestine. And notice that Palestine is two non-contiguous, non-viable pieces of land surrounded by Israel. What we're looking at today in the present is actually, this is also not very accurate because Israel has even more of that. So now I'm no longer sharing my screen. And I think, you know, as I said, it's maybe you can look at these maps and make them, blow them up better. So 80% of the Palestinian people were dispossessed, were displaced, were pushed out of what was all of our historic Palestine and became refugees primarily in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and were denied the right of return. And again, this is in violation of international law, just like it is in violation of international law to seize land through armed means. It is also in violation of international law to not accept. Okay. Okay. So this was issued in December 1948. Thank you, Emilio. I knew I was going to have some challenges. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights issued in 1948, meaning after the displacement of the Palestinians, says everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment. And I'm putting these because, of course, we now know that Israel actually denies Palestinians the right to life, liberty, and security of persons. It also subjects Palestinians to torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment, and has been doing that since 1948. But what's important is Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, namely, everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Palestinians are denied freedom of movement within even the occupied West Bank, and everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. And the Palestinians, of course, have been denied the right of return since 1948, precisely because Israel wants to be a Jewish state, and the demographics would be such that with Palestinians returning, it could not live up to the farce of being Jewish and democratic, because, you know, Palestinians would not have equal rights because it is the Jewish state. So it is denying Palestinians the right of return. It has denied the Palestinians the right of return since 1948 in violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Israel is a signatory to. So Israel is violating even documents that it has signed on to, including the right of return. So I'm trying to get somewhere else here. And these rights were, so we've had a declaration, we've basically had this Declaration of Human Rights since 1948, and we've had a violation of the Palestinian human rights since 1948. The universal inalienable human rights of the Palestinians, Israel has been in violation of that since 1948. In the meantime, of course, if you look at the disappearing Palestine map, the one that shows you how much Israel is gaining, Israel has also been stealing more land, building more settlements, all in violation of international law. International law says that the settlements are illegal. International law says that the occupation is illegal. International law says that you cannot transfer your own people into an occupied people's land. So I mean, the number of international law resolutions that Israel violates is just, you know, gigantic. There are so many. I would need more than an hour to go through the whole list of violations of international law that Israel engages in while being a signatory to these laws. So again, the inadmissibility of gaining land through war is something that is an international law, and Israel 1967, all that it gained in 1967, which is basically the rest of historic Palestine, that is illegal. The occupation is illegal. When we speak of Israel defending itself, it is defending an illegal occupation, and no country has the right to defend an illegal occupation because the occupation is illegal, right? But this is not spoken of. This is not something that the media reports to, basically, that Israel is actually, what Israel is defending is an illegal occupation, and that is a violation of human rights, of international law. We also have, let me see what the next slide is. Okay, so can we, Emilio, could you please show the next slide, Resolution 194?
I think it's there.
Yeah, okay, so UN General Assembly Resolution 194, also issued in December 1948, meaning shortly after the creation of Israel. Article 11 of the resolution resolves that refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return and for loss or damage to property which, under principles of international law or equity, should be made good by the governments of authorities responsible. So again, refugees wishing to return to their homes, which is what Palestinians want. We are a people that is 70% refugees, right? And we do want to return. I want to return. I'm from Jerusalem. I would love to go back to Jerusalem. I'm not allowed to, right? So refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. There is no practicable date for Israel for refugees to return. It does not want the refugees to return. And that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return. Again, no compensation, no reparations, or for loss or damage to property which, under principles of international law, should be made good by the governments. So again, I mean, we have Israelis living in the homes of Palestinians, in the ancestral family homes of Palestinians, without paying for that. So obviously, I mean, this is a United Nations resolution, December 1948, and Israel is also in violation of that. Again, as I said, I could go through a very long list of what Israel is in violation of. I'm just picking some of the very key ones. What's very important, and I think maybe that's our next slide, let me see, is that also Palestinians have the right to resist, right? As an occupied people, we have the right to resist. So, Emilio, if you could move on to the next slide, please.
Done.
All right. So the right to resist, Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ratified by Israel. Ratified by Israel. That is, Israel has signed on to it in 1966, states that all peoples have the right to self-determination. Of course, Palestinians do not have the right to self-determination. It elaborates the right to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, something that Israel has been stifling as harshly as it can possibly do. It is stifling the economic, the social, and the cultural development of Palestine within their own occupied land. And one more slide, please. United Nations Resolution 2787, issued in 1971, reaffirms the legitimacy of the struggle of peoples for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from colonial and foreign domination and foreign occupation by all available means, including armed struggle, right? I'm going to repeat this because it's very important. Palestinians have the right as an occupied people to resist their occupation. United Nations Resolution 2787 reaffirms the legitimacy of the struggle of people for independence. Palestinians are not independent because of Israel. Territorial integrity, we do not have that. National unity, we also don't have that. And liberation from colonial and foreign domination and foreign occupation by all available means, including armed struggle. So when Palestinians engage in armed struggle against Israel, this is actually legal. What we hear over and over and over again is Israel has the right to defend itself. What we need to be hearing is that Israel is defending an illegal occupation. And one thing we never hear, even though it actually is in the United Nations resolution, is that Palestinians have the right to resist and to liberate themselves from foreign occupation by all means necessary, including armed struggle. When have we heard that the Palestinians have the right to defend themselves? When have we heard this resolution? Palestinians have the right to struggle for independence, including by armed struggle. So we're looking at basically, again, I'm just giving the context of everything that is the violation of international law and the suppression of the inalienable human rights of the Palestinians. So we move on to the next slide, the slide on apartheid. Again, I'm going to assume that you have some slight knowledge of what is going on, the fact that, within the West Bank, for example, there are roads that only Jewish Israelis can drive on. The license plates of cars are color-coded, and if it's a yellow license plate, it can go on the highway, but if it's a Palestinian license plate, which is green, it can't drive on the highway. So we have an extreme system of apartheid, or absolute segregation, roads for Jews and roads for Arabs, for Palestinians, and we have all this system, like, again, an entire overstructure, infrastructure, legal system of apartheid. And apartheid, according to the United Nations General Assembly definition in 1973, is inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. I'm going to assume that anyone who's here at this lecture today understands that basically what Israel is doing is establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons. And there's also in the United Nations a definition of what is viewed as a racial group of persons, because one can say, it's an ethnicity, it's a community, but according to the UN definition of racial group of persons, the Israelis and the Jews make up one racial group of persons, which is actually oppressing the other people, establishing and maintaining domination over the Palestinians and systematically oppressing them. Again, the entire structure of Israel is a structure that is meant to oppress the Palestinians, dispossess them, keep them under domination, and that is the definition of apartheid. Next slide, please. The ICC, the International Criminal Court definition of apartheid is similarly something very similar: inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime, which is what we have in Israel, of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. Again, when we think of the entire system of laws and non-laws, the para-laws, if you want, the actual lived experience as well as the legal infrastructure of Israel, what we see is that Israel is engaging in apartheid against the Palestinians. Let me see what's next. And apartheid is a crime against humanity. So that's our next. There are 4 categories of crimes, and the International Criminal Court is basically the court that judges what countries are doing against each other rather than what individuals. That's what the ICC is. There are 4 categories of crimes. There's the crime of genocide, there's the crimes against humanity, there's crimes of aggression, and war crimes. And apartheid, which is the system that we now have in Palestine, is a crime against humanity. So Israel is an illegal occupier engaging in a crime against humanity. Okay, so we can stop now. Of course, genocide is also a crime against humanity, and what we are witnessing today in in Gaza is a genocide of the Palestinian people, with the calls for finish them all. We are dealing with human animals. We are cutting off the power. We are cutting off the water. And this has been going on for 17 years. So it was what I call slow motion genocide that is not that is now turning into accelerated genocide. So let me see. All right, so let's move on to the definition of genocide, please. I appreciate you very much, Emilio. Okay, is everything okay? All right. So the UN definition of genocide: any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups as such: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Again, any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Again, think of what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. Intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a group, national, ethnic, religious, or racial, by killing members of the group. Of course, Israel wants to kill every last Palestinian. It is saying so. Kill them all. And the Palestinians, they are human animals, and we must treat them accordingly. Causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group, of course it's doing that. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. I mean, the blockade of Gaza over the past 17 years is absolutely inflicting on the group conditions of life calculating to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. The blockade is a blockade that is actually suffocating the Palestinians, depriving them of fuel, of water, of electricity, of food, of medical supplies. That is deliberately inflicting, and it is very deliberate, conditions that hurt the Palestinian life. Imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the groups. Again, I mean, that's not necessarily, I mean, the result of the blockade, the consequences of blockade is, of course, that, Palestinians are having miscarriages, or the babies are dying, infants are dying. There's actually an infant that was born just in the past 17 days of this last massacre since October 7. There was one infant that was born like on October 8th and is already killed, already dead, right? I mean, we're having, these are the circumstances that we are trying to survive in. I could talk about the West Bank too, that basically the checkpoints that prevent women from reaching a hospital, where women are actually giving birth at the checkpoints, where women are dying at the checkpoints, where infants that are delivered at the checkpoints are dying on the checkpoints. These are measures imposed to prevent birth. Israel views Palestinians as a demographic threat. We are a demographic threat because our numbers are going to take over the Jewish numbers, and then it won't be able to claim that it's a democracy. Well, it no longer wants to claim that it's a democracy, but for the longest time, it was claiming to be that. And so Palestinians are viewed as a demographic threat. And it's very important to talk about basically the intentional, this imposing measures to prevent birth from within the group. This is not just a side effect, an unintended side effect of Israel's occupation. Israel actually, Israel is in 1967, when Israel took over the West Bank, the first thing it did was it actually stopped issuing licenses to the Daya. The Daya is a traditional midwife, the Palestinian traditional midwife. It stopped issuing licenses to the Dayat, the traditional midwives. And so by stopping to do that, the Dayats were practicing illegally. if they helped a woman deliver, as midwives do. They were practicing illegally, and then they would either be jailed or lose their license. The fact that Israel stopped issuing licenses also means that no new woman could get that license and become a daya. So the dayas basically became illegal. Nobody could become that. As a result of that, women had to deliver in the hospitals, and the hospitals were out of reach, and the hospitals were in areas within 12 checkpoints away, and the women's access to the hospitals became extremely challenging, and women started giving birth at checkpoints and either dying or the children dying. So, this is not a side effect. This is not something that Israel had not considered. This is part of the occupation, of the system of occupation, of the system of basically genocide. So let me see if there's... So another example of Israel's intention to engage in genocide, like an overt contention, is Emilio, if you could move to the next slide, please. Yes, I see your thumb up, but it's not moving. Okay, so I guess I had another one in mind, but that's
Article 3, right?
Okay, I thought I had someone else. Maybe it's next. Crimes that can be punished under the Convention of the Genocide. Okay, genocide is a crime that can be punished. Conspiracy to commit genocide, even if you don't do it, if you conspire, like when, for example, the US says we fully support Israel and we are going to send weapons and warships and troops to Israel. Direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, and complicity in genocide. So we're looking at all of the countries that are cheering on as Israel is engaging in this. All of these are punishable under the Genocide Convention. Maybe the next slide is the one where I wanted to see the direct call for genocide. Yeah, I mean, this was just a few days ago, a week or so ago, the Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, said, I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. I mean, when you say, and you can control that, I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel, also no medicine, also no nothing. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. This is the Israeli Defense Minister in the past week. I don't know exactly what date because by now it's been a blur since October 7, but this is the Israeli Defense Minister, and we have countries, primarily Western countries, siding with this, right? Siding with what is an open call for genocide. The dehumanization of Palestinians has been so complete in the mainstream Western mind that when someone says that, they can be cheered on and supported rather than told you are a monster, right? So this is the context that I wanted to talk about when we see what happened with October 7. But I also want to talk about the fact that basically Palestinians have been resisting our dispossession from the minute we became aware of these plans. As I said earlier in this talk, but already in the 1920s, the Palestinians were protesting the British mandate. The Great Revolt of 1936 to 39 was a revolt against the plans to dispossess us. And mostly, resistance has taken on non-military forms. Even though we have the right to armed struggle, resistance has taken on non-military forms. And I think that's basically a strategic, logical thing. It's like, we do not have the weapons of Israel. We do not have the military might of Israel. We cannot stand up to, Israel being armed by the West and supported and financed and given political immunity by the West. So resistance has taken on mostly non-political forms, but keep in mind that even non-military, non-armed, non-militant resistance has been shut down over and over again. For example, the BDS campaign, excuse me. I think I may have a slide on the BDS. Let me see. Okay, so next slide, our history of unarmed protest. So the BDS campaign, inspired by South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle, the BDS campaign is basically a call for non-armed, non-violent resistance until Israel abides by international law. That's all we're asking. Israel should abide by international law. The demands of BDS, which are basically demands for Israel to stop violating the human rights of the Palestinian people, are considered extreme. Like, how could a demand for stop violating international law and stop violating the rights of the Palestinian people be considered a threat to Israel? And yet Israel has done its absolute best to shut down BDS, which only threatens Israel because it's an educational campaign. I am a BDS activist. I organize for BDS all the time. And I keep telling people that it's a form of economic activism that does not have an economic impact. And by which I explain, like, we can, here within the US, we can boycott every single Israeli product that exists anywhere, every single Palestinian Israeli product in every single grocery store, in every single US states in this country. We would not be making an economic impact on Israel because really there's not that much to boycott. We would not be making an economic impact, but the impact we are making as we explain why we engage in BDS, that's the impact that we are making on Israel. If we made an economic impact, the US would just churn a slightly bigger check, as it has done now, So but even BDS, which is not even an economic threat to Israel, is considered an existential threat to Israel. According to the Israeli think tanks, BDS is an existential threat to Israel. It is the most unarmed, non-violent form of protest. The Gaza flotilla was basically civilian ships trying to deliver aid to Gaza, and they tried it on 3 different years, and it's basically unarmed civilians from various countries in the world coming into Gaza on ships, basically to deliver medical supplies, primarily medical supplies and food and stuff like that. And the Gaza flotilla was also, which, as I said, it's part of the unarmed protest, and it was a grassroots protest where the civilians marched, where basically there was an attempt to break the blockade, and Israeli people attacked the boats. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my, there were 3 flotilla attempts, and in 2010, the last year of the attempt, Israel attacked the ships, killing 9 activists. And then a United Nations HRC, Human Rights Commission, report in September 2010, shortly after that, it looked into the incident and it deemed the blockade illegal. Of course, the blockade is illegal. And it stated that Israel's actions were disproportionate and betrayed an unacceptable level of brutality with evidence of willful killing. Okay, so this is an example of unarmed resistance, not even resistance, an attempt to break the illegal blockade. The United Nations decided that the blockade is illegal, that Israel's actions were disproportionate and betrayed an unacceptable level of brutality with evidence of willful killing. The United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the time also said that had a similar report, and the Palmer report found that the degree of force used against the Mavi Marmara, which was one of the ships that Israel attacked as part of the Gaza flotilla, was excessive and unreasonable, and that the way Israel treated the detained crew members violated international human rights law, right? So we're talking about, that's one example of completely unarmed grassroots, unarmed protest and Israel's response. The BDS is completely similarly a nonviolent protest, and Israel responds very, very, very harshly. The other one is, of course, the Gaza Great March of Return, which happened in 2018, and the Great March of Return, which took place in the Gaza Strip, where basically it was supposed to go from Land Day, March 30th, to Nakba Day, to May 14th, and it was unarmed civilians in Gaza, unarmed civilians marching towards the borders, and Israeli snipers shot at unarmed civilians. At least 189 Palestinians were killed between March and December. Israeli soldiers fired tear gas and live ammunition. And according to the Middle East, to the head of the Middle East International Committee of the Red Cross, more than 13,000 Palestinians were wounded. Those are unarmed Palestinians within Gaza marching towards the border in a show of like, we want to return. You know, this is our right. Since 1948, it's been violated. So the Great March of Return was Palestinians marching within Gaza towards the borders. And more than 13,000 Palestinians were wounded. The majority were severely wounded. About 1,500 were struck by 3 to 5 bullets, and no Israeli was physically harmed until March. One Israeli soldier on May 14th was harmed. So we have, the Palestinians marching within their own occupied land towards the border, and 13,000 are severely wounded by Israeli snipers shooting at them. So these are all examples of the unarmed protest and how Israel is even suppressing very, very, very heavy-handedly, lethally, mortally unarmed protest. So I want to say this because we have a history, and this is the recent history, right? I mean, there's, again, I mentioned previous moments, again, Israel shutting down the civil disobedience and so on. So we have this long history of unarmed protest, and then, Hamas engages in this, and Israel is like, oh, well, it's Hamas. Hamas is the problem. Hamas is the problem. Israel does not have a Hamas problem. Israel has a Palestine problem. The Palestinian people, all of the Palestinian people, asking for our rights in any way, asking for our right of return, asking for our human rights, asking for an end to the violation of international law and to the violation of our inalienable human rights. That's what Israel has a problem with. And Hamas is like a convenient boogeyman. But when we look at the whole history of dispossession, it is not, Israel has a Palestine problem, not a Hamas problem. So I've given the context, and now I'm going to, as a result, we have what is currently going on in Gaza, and we have to get out of it. So next slide, please. What now? Obviously, what is going on in Gaza now is beyond in any way humanly acceptable. There is a genocide going on. Again, I don't want to go into the details, but if anyone looks at it, it's like entire building blocks, entire neighborhoods completely erased. According to the last count, Israel has killed a Palestinian every 2 minutes since it all started, and a child every 5 minutes. We're talking about, if, again, I'm assuming that you know what Gaza is like. There's nowhere to go to. It's overpopulated. It's completely besieged. There is no, and people don't want to leave. I mean, Palestinians are saying, we don't want to leave. We have been leaving since 1948. We don't want to leave. This is our land. We belong here. You cannot displace us anymore. We will die here rather than leave again. And Israel is basically intent on killing them when it says every last one of them. So what now? We absolutely need a ceasefire, but a ceasefire is not enough. Ceasefire as a floor, not a ceiling. It's not the limit of our demands. A ceasefire is absolutely important, but a ceasefire alone is not justice. We need to lift the blockade, and Israel must stop violating international law and the human rights of the Palestinian people. That is a basic demand, not just ceasefire and go back to the way it was. Ceasefire and go back to the way it was is ceasefire and go back to oppression, to violation of international law, violation of human rights. It is not enough. The blockade is genocidal. It needs to stop. It needs to be lifted. Israel must stop violating the international law, and the only solution, once we achieve a ceasefire and lifting the blockade, the only solution, that's our next slide, please. We need decolonization. The Palestinian people is a colonized people. Colonization is wrong. We need liberation and we need return. That is, I mean, it's the only solution. It's the only thing that actually achieves justice rather than a continuation of oppression. So the siege must be lifted. The US must stop arming Israel. The West must stop giving immunity to Israel. And finally, let me see what my next slide is. Yeah, that's my next slide. It's my concluding slide. What our refusal to leave again, to be displaced again, or even to die, or to be silenced, or to be erased, what our refusal means, to be eliminated, what we mean is that the Palestinian psyche is free. We are psychologically free. Our psyche is liberated. We are a country that is going through decolonization, but our psyche being liberated is not enough. Our bodies and our lands also must be liberated. We are an indigenous people. We belong to the land. Israelis think that they own the land. We belong to the land. As an indigenous people, our struggle is a decolonial struggle. Our psyche is liberated, but we must also liberate our bodies and our land. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Dr. Nada, and thanks everyone. So I would like to, of course, thank you again for taking us through an historical journey, which is also very much rooted in the way you explain it within and through a legal framework that is always remind us the importance to understand the question of Palestine. As of course, of course, now we are reaching extremely tragic and brutal days, but the question of an ongoing Nakba has always been part of a Palestinian narrative and Palestinian voice. So it's always important to think, when we look at historical events, to think them as a projection of certain continuities that exist and are very rooted in political and historical events. I would like to open the floor now to everyone. Please you are very welcome to raise your hand and possibly also open your camera if you wish. Otherwise, we of course have the option of the chat, and you're welcome to paste your question in the chat.